There was a man who was sort of in a jam, so he promised God, if God could get him out of the jam, he would go to church. Well, things in his life did smooth out a bit, so he said, okay, Lord, I promised you, I'm going to that church down the street. So he went that Sunday, but things didn't go exactly like he had hoped. But a promise is a promise, he said, so the next Sunday he went back to the church. But again, he left feeling sort of out of things there. Third time's the charm, he said. So back he went a third Sunday to the church. But again, he left just feeling kind of left out. So he said to God, Lord, I really tried, but I just can't keep my promise. I just can't fit in with that church. The Lord said, I understand, my child. I've been trying to get in that church for years. Who's out? Who's in? We live in a very out or in world where differences of power and privilege are part of our culture. Rich, poor, black, white, Republican, Democrat. And we tend to identify with our in crowd according to the group that seems to be the most like us, or at least the most like what we would like to be. Now, Jesus lived in a world that was even more sharply divided, especially around issues of who has power. But Jesus went about seeking to build a kingdom where all people had a place, where everyone had the opportunity to do well in life, had respect and dignity. But his time was growing short. This story that Nancy read for us finds Jesus on a journey. It is his final journey between his life in Galilee and his death in Jerusalem. There are three people that enter the story. The first man says, Lord, I will follow you. And Jesus basically says, look, I'm homeless. So the guy stays home. Then Jesus asks another if he would follow him. And he says, I need to go bury my father. So he asks a third person, will you follow me? Yes, Lord. I just need to run home, say bye to my family, grab my toothbrush. Well, Jesus did not like any of those answers. And so he basically says, well, you are all just out of the kingdom of God. Now, these are good folks. These are volunteer at church folks, give to mission, sing in the choir, take care of their families. I mean, good folks. Good folks like you and me. And yet Jesus tells them they are out of the kingdom of God. It's somewhat of a perplexing text. And as I've pondered it, I have continued to remember something that happened 4 years ago this month. You will remember too. The murders at Mother Emanuel AME Church. Do you remember how distressing that was? This young white supremacist went on a Wednesday evening to Mother Emanuel, this historic black church. And he sat there with a small group of worshipers. And as the worship service drew toward its end, he took out his gun and he killed them all, except for one, who was his witness that a race war had started. Well, needless to say, there was a lot of unrest in all of us when we got that news. African Americans were angry and they were afraid. People with my skin color were concerned, stunned, shocked, and not really knowing exactly how to respond. There were a few African American clergy people and white clergy people who were talking about this together, and they decided we needed to have a prayer service, a multi-faith, biracial prayer service that Saturday morning. So hastily, some of us were called, and we planned a prayer service for Saturday. It was one of the most powerful things I have ever experienced. There were 58 clergy people. Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, AME, Disciple. We were all dressed in our typical worship leadership garb. And we gathered there along with others who had gotten the word and who had come to the prayer service. Representatives of the different faiths, including 2 rabbis and 1 Sikh leader, spoke. There were prayer after prayer after prayer for forgiveness, for hope, for change. There were voices of rage and a whole lot of tears shed. I remember at the beginning of the service, although we acted buddy, it was sort of an awkward feeling between, at least for me, with my black colleagues. What do you say at such a time? But by the end of the service, we were one. We were together. We were determined. We were going to make a change. We were called up front, and we stood on the dais, all 58 of us, and without even planning it, we just locked arms in that traditional pose, like we were going to walk across Pettit's Bridge in Selma, Alabama, in the Civil Rights Movement, 1965. The congregation stood, and we began to sing. We shall overcome. And in that moment, we believed we could. We believed something was starting that day that would end the divisions and the racial divides in this country. We shall overcome. Our hearts were so full, tears were streaming down our cheeks, and I don't know how the stained glass windows at Peachtree Christian Church, where the service was, I don't know how they didn't implode. We were so loud. We sang with all the power of our hearts and our longing for something to change. We shall overcome someday. We really believed we could. We were high on God, and I think the heavens were dancing with hope. That was 4 years ago. After the service, we had all hugged each other and made sure our names and our correct email addresses were on the list. For we were going to form a biracial, multi-faith coalition to address issues of social justice in metropolitan Atlanta. 4 years. I have often wondered, whatever happened to that dream, that hope, that coalition that never met? But time dims the power of a moment, the passion of a call. And good people go back to the everyday business of human living. Fathers need to be buried. Families need to be attended. Oh, random acts of violence would occur, and we would hear the news over the airwaves and feel bad about it. But then it was time to get to work or to go to school or go to the gym. Political rhetoric would ramp up and divide us even further until it was time to get dinner on the table. Fears and hopes would rise and fall as the lines between who's in and whose out were sharpened. Mistrust grew. This text says we can do better. This text says we can do more. Jesus has gone on ahead to Jerusalem to save the world, and we are been called to travel with him. It is daunting. The challenges along the issues of divides between people are extreme. Last year, there were over 500 reported incidents of anti-Muslim behaviors in the United States. Random shootings have become almost commonplace on the news. People killed in Virginia just a few weeks ago. This year, so far, we have an average of every other week a school shooting. 30 people have lost their lives. Last month, 3 black churches were burned. A synagogue and a Jewish life center lost people to mass shootings. A rabbi's home was fired upon also. Week before last, another black man lost his life to a white police officer. It's almost like we get out of step with Jesus. I mean, we bring the pain of those things, the concern for those individuals involved. We bring our anguish about not knowing what to do. We bring it to church and we give it to God. And Monday morning, everything is pretty much the way it was. We don't really change. Our change comes so very slowly. I wonder if maybe that's what this text is talking about. In the Gospel of Luke, we get a very human picture of Jesus. There are several little pericopes where you see he seems to be a little bit irritated with folks, a little perplexed, a little bit like, oh, are my disciples ever going to get it? I wonder if that is going on. He knows there is so much left that he wanted to do. And there's so little time. He has set his face to Jerusalem and his death. I know he had to be concerned. Had he done enough? Did his disciples really understand about the kingdom of God? Would his mission go forward? Or after his death, would they go back to fishing? And he would have failed. We good folk can get out of step with Jesus, certainly a few steps behind. Time has a way of erasing our very best intentions. But out of the kingdom of God, that's not what the Jesus story is all about. Just a few chapters over from this pericope, there's another story of a Samaritan. You remember, a Samaritan was despised. He was unclean to those to whom Jesus was talking. And yet the Samaritan becomes the hero of the story, while the good folks, the priest, the rabbi, the Levite, they pass by pulling them roads tightly that they not get in contact with the man who is wounded. Who's out? Who's in? And then another few chapters, still in this long travel dialogue that Luke gives us, is that well-known story of the 2 sons. The rebellious younger one who insults his father, takes his share of the inheritance and goes off to a far country and spends it all in a little hanky-panky And the older son, who stays home, does what he's supposed to do, takes care of all the chores and the responsibilities. But then when the younger son comes home and the father throws the party of the century to celebrate his being back in the family, the older son is so angry, he opts out of the celebration. Who's out? Who's in? We have a God who's always turning things inside out and outside in. It's one of the ways God teaches us that the in group of the kingdom of God has no boundaries, sets up no barriers. A Samaritan can belong, a recalcitrant older brother, a rebellious younger one, a doubting Thomas, a denying Peter, all kinds of good folks who could do better. A you, a me. And if we choose to close our eyes to the anguish and pain of the world around us, if we choose to close our eyes to the gun violence, to the hate crimes and the hate speech and the prejudices in our culture, if we choose to silence our voices before injustice and focus only in that which affects our particular in-group, then neither the kingdom of God nor the ideals of this country, which we love, will thrive among us. God calls us to love more deeply, to have a heart that is bigger, hands that reach beyond self, and a church where who's out and who's in has no meaning at all.